I never imagined that the worst betrayal of my life would also become my greatest victory. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of justice that reveals itself in the most unexpected ways. When Dexter walked out of our home with his suitcases packed, and that woman clinging to his arm like she had won some grand prize, I felt my entire world collapse around me in a way that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to believe that the man I had loved for 15 years could transform into someone so cold and calculating. The house stood silent around me that evening, every corner whispering memories of what we had been, every photograph on the wall a painful reminder of promises that had crumbled to dust. I wandered through the rooms we had decorated together, touching the furniture we had chosen on lazy Saturday afternoons, standing in the kitchen where we had cooked countless meals and shared countless conversations, and I couldn't comprehend how everything had fallen apart so completely and so suddenly. Liana was her name, and just saying it made my stomach turn with a mixture of rage and humiliation that I had never experienced before in my entire life. She worked at Dexter's company, one of those bright young things with perfect hair and perfect teeth, and a perfect body that hadn't been through 15 years of marriage and stress and sacrifice. She was everything I felt I wasn't anymore, everything that made me question my worth and my attractiveness and my value as a woman and a wife. Dexter had been having an affair with her for 8 months before he finally confessed. 8 months of lies and late nights at the office and business trips that weren't really business trips at all. When he finally told me the truth, sitting across from me at our dining room table with tears in his eyes that, I now realize, were more about his guilt than any real remorse, he said things that cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. He said our marriage had become stale and predictable, that I had let myself go, that he needed excitement and passion and something more than what we had become. He said he still cared about me, but wasn't in love with me anymore, as if that distinction somehow made his betrayal less devastating, less cruel, less absolutely soul-destroying. I remember that night so vividly, every detail burned into my memory like a brand that will never fade no matter how much time passes. The way his hands shook as he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he spoke, the way the clock on the wall kept ticking its steady rhythm while my entire world shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I asked him how he could do this to us, to me, to everything we had built together through all the struggles and celebrations and ordinary moments that make up a marriage. He had no answer that made any sense. Just vague statements about needing to feel alive again, about not wanting to live a lie anymore, about how Liana understood him in ways I apparently never could. The words felt like daggers, each one finding a vulnerable spot and twisting until I thought I might actually die from the pain of it all. I had stood by this man through everything, absolutely everything, and this was how he repaid my loyalty and love and unwavering support. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks later, and they were brutal in ways I couldn't have anticipated even in my darkest imaginings. Dexter hired Marcus Thornwell, a lawyer with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless and for winning cases that seemed unwinnable through sheer aggressive tactics and willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. From the very first meeting, it became clear that Dexter and his legal team were going to paint me as the villain in our story. The lazy wife who had contributed nothing of value to the marriage, the burden that had held him back from achieving his full potential. They claimed that I had stopped working meaningful jobs years ago, that I had become dependent on his income, that I had let our home fall into disrepair, that I had essentially checked out of our marriage long before he sought comfort elsewhere. Every accusation was a distortion of the truth, a twisted version of reality that made me want to scream at the injustice of it all. The truth was so different from the story they were telling, so completely opposite that I couldn't believe anyone would believe their lies. I had worked 2 jobs to put Dexter through business school when we were young and struggling, waiting tables during the day and working as a night receptionist at a hotel just so he could pursue his dreams without the burden of student debt crushing his spirit. I had sacrificed my own career aspirations in marketing to support his climb up the corporate ladder, moving 3 times for his promotions, leaving behind friends and opportunities and the life I was building for myself. I had been the one to take care of his aging mother when she got sick, spending months at her bedside while he traveled for work, managing her medications and doctor appointments and eventual hospice care. I had been his rock, his support system, his biggest cheerleader. And now he was rewriting our entire history to make himself look like the victim, and me like some kind of parasite who had drained him dry. Watching Dexter parade around town with Leanna on his arm was a special kind of torture that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. They showed up at our favorite restaurants, the ones where we had celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and promotions, sitting in booths where we had once sat, laughing and touching each other with the kind of casual intimacy that felt like a personal attack on everything I had believed our marriage to be. They went to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, walking hand in hand through the stalls where I had shopped for years, picking out vegetables and flowers like they were playing house with my life. My friends would see them and report back to me with sympathetic faces and careful words, trying to spare my feelings while also keeping me informed, and each report felt like another small death of the life I had known. I started avoiding places I loved, changing my routines to minimize the chances of running into them, shrinking my world smaller and smaller, until I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of my own existence. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation or the gossip that followed me wherever I went in our small town. The worst part was the damage it did to my sense of self. The way it made me question everything I thought I knew about who I was and what I was worth. I would stand in front of the mirror and pick apart every flaw, every wrinkle, every pound I had gained over the years, wondering what Liana had that I didn't, wondering what I could have done differently to keep my husband interested in me. I stopped wearing makeup because what was the point? I stopped buying new clothes because who was I trying to impress? I stopped making plans with friends because I couldn't bear the pity in their eyes when they looked at me. The unspoken relief that this tragedy had happened to me and not to them. Depression settled over me like a heavy blanket, making even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming and pointless. My lawyer, Patricia Chen, was the only bright spot in those dark months, a sharp and compassionate woman who seemed genuinely invested in fighting for me even when I had lost the will to fight for myself. She listened to my story without judgment, took detailed notes about our marriage and our assets and the lies Dexter's team was spreading, and assured me that we would find a way through this nightmare even though it didn't feel possible at the time. She explained the divorce process in terms I could understand, walked me through what to expect in mediation and court, and answered my panicked phone calls at all hours with patience and kindness that made me cry with gratitude. But even Patricia couldn't hide the fact that things weren't going well. That the judge seemed sympathetic to Dexter's narrative, that the division of assets was leaning heavily in his favor, despite all my contributions to our life together. Dexter's financial records showed that he had been the primary earner for the past 7 years, and the judge seemed to weigh that fact heavily in his calculations without considering the reasons why or the sacrifices that had enabled that earning potential. The joint bank account that we had built up over years of careful saving was split down the middle, giving Dexter his half immediately while my half was tied up in complicated legal proceedings that would take months to resolve. The car that we had purchased together 3 years earlier, a sensible sedan that I drove daily for errands and appointments, was awarded to Dexter because the title was primarily in his name even though I had made half the payments. Piece by piece, the life we had built together was being dismantled and divided, and I was losing more than I was gaining in ways that felt deliberately cruel and punishing. But then everything changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October. One of those gray days where the sky seems to press down on you and the cold seeps into your bones, no matter how many layers you wear. I was home alone, something I had gotten used to in the months since Dexter left. Surrounded by the silence and emptiness that had become my constant companions. I had been trying to organize the chaos of papers and documents that had accumulated during the divorce, sorting through financial statements and legal filings and old tax returns in an attempt to regain some sense of control over my life. In the back of the bedroom closet, Shoved behind boxes of old clothes and forgotten belongings, I found a container I didn't remember putting there. One of those plastic file boxes with a lid that snaps shut to keep documents safe and dry. Inside that box were papers from the early years of our marriage. Things we had saved and forgotten about as life got busy and complicated and full. There were our marriage certificate, with its official seal and careful calligraphy, old insurance policies that had long since expired, tax returns from when we were young and broke and filing jointly for the first time. And there, near the bottom of the stack, was the deed to our house. The home we had purchased 12 years earlier when we were full of hope and plans for the future we would build together. I pulled it out with trembling hands, unfolding the heavy paper and smoothing out the creases. And as I read the ownership information, my heart began to race in a way that made me dizzy and breathless and terrified to hope that what I was seeing could possibly be real. The deed listed only one owner, only one name in the carefully typed legal language that determined who had rights to the property. That name was Vivian Marie Ashford, my maiden name, the name I had legally before I married. Dexter took his last name in a ceremony that now felt like it had happened to a completely different person in a completely different lifetime. The property was solely and entirely in my name, with no mention of Dexter anywhere on the document, no joint ownership, no legal tie between him and this house that we had both called home for over a decade. I sat there on the closet floor, staring at that piece of paper, reading it over and over again, to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding or misreading or seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. And slowly the memory of why this had happened began to surface from the depths of my mind where it had been buried under years of other concerns and priorities. When we decided to buy the house 12 years earlier, Dexter had been in the middle of a financial crisis that threatened to derail all our plans and dreams for the future. He had student loans that were in default because of some bureaucratic nightmare with his payment plan, credit cards that were maxed out from unexpected medical bills when he had been hospitalized for appendicitis, and a credit score that was so low that no bank would even consider giving him a mortgage. We were desperate to buy before interest rates went up even more, desperate to stop throwing money away on rent and start building equity in a property of our own. Desperate to take advantage of a seller's market and a house that was priced below what it should have been because the owners needed to relocate quickly for work. So we made a decision that seemed practical and temporary at the time, a stopgap measure that we would fix as soon as Dexter's credit recovered and his financial situation stabilized. We put the house entirely in my name, using my credit score and my income and my financial history to secure the mortgage and complete the purchase. Dexter contributed to the down payment from his savings, and we agreed that we would refinance in a year or two to add his name to the deed and make the ownership officially joint once his credit was repaired and his financial crisis was resolved. But life got busy and complicated the way it always does, and that refinancing never happened because there never seemed to be a good time or a pressing reason to deal with the paperwork and fees and hassle involved. We moved on to other priorities and other concerns, paying the mortgage together from our joint account, making improvements to the property together, treating the house as ours in every way that mattered, even though legally it had only ever been mine. And somewhere in the chaos and routine of married life, we both completely forgot about that detail, that legal technicality that now represented the single most important fact in my entire divorce case. I called Patricia immediately, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone steady enough to dial her number. When she answered, I could barely get the words out, stammering and crying and trying to explain what I had found without entirely believing it myself. She told me to take a photo of the deed and send it to her right away, and I did. Watching the image upload with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. She called me back within 20 minutes, and I could hear the excitement and disbelief in her voice as she explained what this meant, what this changed, how this single document had just shifted the entire balance of power in my divorce case. The house that Dexter thought he owned, that his lawyer had calculated as part of the marital assets to be divided, that everyone had assumed was jointly owned because we had lived in it together for 12 years, was actually entirely and completely my separate property that he had no legal claim to whatsoever. Patricia explained the law to me in careful detail, making sure I understood the full implications of what we had discovered. In our state, property that was held in sole name before or during a marriage remained separate property unless it was explicitly converted to joint ownership through refinancing or a quitclaim deed that transferred partial ownership to the spouse. Simply paying the mortgage together from joint funds or making improvements to the property together wasn't enough to create a legal ownership interest for the non-titled spouse. The house was mine, had always been mine from a legal standpoint, and would remain mine regardless of what the divorce settlement said about other assets. Even better, the house had appreciated significantly in value over the 12 years we had owned it, going from the $200,000 we had paid to over $500,000 in the current market, meaning that the equity I owned free and clear was substantial enough to change my entire financial situation and future prospects. We filed an emergency motion the very next morning, and I watched Patricia work with an efficiency and determination that made me grateful. Beyond words that she was on my side in this battle, she drafted legal arguments citing case law and property statutes, attached copies of the original deed and mortgage documents, and requested an immediate hearing to clarify the property division before the final divorce decree was signed. Dexter's lawyer Marcus Thornwell responded within days with his own motion trying to argue that the house should still be considered marital property because Dexter had contributed to the mortgage payments and had made improvements to the property over the years. But Patricia tore those arguments apart with precision and ruthlessness that made me want to cheer out loud when I read her response. She pointed out that contributions to mortgage payments came from joint funds that Dexter had already received his share of in the asset division, that improvements to property don't create an ownership interest without a legal transfer of title, and that the law was absolutely clear on this point, regardless of what Dexter or his lawyer wished it to be. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and I spent those 14 days swinging between hope and terror, barely sleeping and barely eating as I waited to see if the judge would rule in my favor or find some way to give Dexter what he wanted despite the clear legal facts. Patricia prepared me carefully for what to expect, explaining that judges generally followed property law strictly in these matters, but that Dexter's team would do everything possible to muddy the waters and create confusion. She coached me on how to present myself in court, what questions I might be asked, how to stay calm and clear even when Dexter's lawyer tried to rattle me with accusations and implications. I practiced my answers until they felt natural, went through my wardrobe a dozen times trying to find something that looked professional and put together when I felt anything but, and counted down the days with a mixture of anticipation and dread that made every hour feel like an eternity. The morning of the hearing I woke up before dawn, my stomach churning with anxiety and my mind racing with worst-case scenarios that I couldn't seem to stop imagining. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that Patricia had suggested, applied makeup with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and drove to the courthouse in rush-hour traffic that seemed designed specifically to increase my stress level to unbearable heights. Patricia met me outside the courtroom looking confident and prepared, carrying a briefcase full of documents and evidence and legal precedents that she assured me would win our case. We went over our strategy one final time, and then we walked into the courtroom together to face Dexter and his legal team and whatever the judge would decide about my future. Dexter was already seated at the defendant's table with Marcus Thornwell, dressed in an expensive suit that I knew he had bought specifically for court appearances, because image mattered to him more than almost anything else. He wouldn't look at me when I entered, keeping his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him with a rigidity that betrayed how nervous he was despite his attempts to appear calm and confident. Liana was sitting in the gallery behind him, her presence a violation of the unspoken rules about what was appropriate during divorce proceedings. Her perfect hair and perfect outfit a reminder of everything that had brought us to this moment. I felt a surge of anger and hurt seeing her there, But I forced myself to look away and focus on what mattered, on the legal battle that was about to determine whether I would have any financial security or whether Dexter would take that from me too. The judge entered and we all stood, going through the ritual formalities that precede every court hearing, and then Patricia began presenting our case with a clarity and force that made me proud to have her as my advocate. She walked the judge through the timeline of our property purchase, presented the original deed showing sole ownership in my name, explained the legal standards for separate versus marital property, and cited multiple cases where courts had ruled exactly as we were asking this judge to rule. Dexter's lawyer tried to interrupt several times with objections that the judge overruled, clearly frustrated that his usual aggressive tactics weren't working in the face of such clear legal facts. When it was his turn to present arguments, Marcus Thornwell stood up and launched into a passionate speech about fairness and equity and the spirit of marriage as a partnership, trying to appeal to the judge's emotions rather than addressing the legal issues that actually mattered in property law. He argued that Dexter had paid half the mortgage for 12 years, that he had contributed to improvements and repairs and maintenance, that he had treated the house as his own because that was what married couples did, and it was unfair to punish him now for trusting his wife and not insisting on legal protections during the marriage. He painted me as a conniving woman who had deliberately kept the house in my sole name as some kind of insurance policy, who had planned all along to use this technicality to cheat Dexter out of what was rightfully his, who was now showing my true colors by refusing to share property that any reasonable person would consider jointly owned. The accusations were so absurd and so contrary to the actual history of our marriage that I had to bite my tongue to keep from shouting out the truth. But Patricia had warned me to stay quiet and let her handle the arguments, no matter how much I wanted to defend myself. When Patricia stood up for her rebuttal, she systematically demolished every argument that Marcus Thornwell had made, with a precision that was beautiful to watch. She pointed out that property law existed specifically to avoid relying on vague notions of fairness and equity, that the whole point of deeds and titles was to create clear ownership that couldn't be disputed based on feelings or assumptions. She noted that Dexter had agreed to the arrangement of sole ownership in my name, that he had never requested to be added to the deed during 12 years of marriage, that he had been aware of the situation and chose not to address it just as much as I had. She reminded the judge that Dexter had already received his share of all other marital assets, including funds from the joint account that had been used to pay the mortgage, meaning he had already been compensated for his contributions to the house expenses. And she stated bluntly that if the court started ignoring property law in favor of subjective determinations about what seemed fair in each individual case, it would create chaos in divorce proceedings and undermine the entire legal system that governed property ownership and transfer. The judge listened to both sides carefully, asked a few clarifying questions about specific aspects of property law that seemed particularly relevant to our case, and then announced that he would review the case law Patricia had cited and issue a written ruling within 1 week. That week was pure agony, every day stretching out endlessly as I waited for news that would determine my entire future. I couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't read or watch television, or have normal conversations because my mind was constantly spinning through possible outcomes and their implications. Patricia called me twice to reassure me that she felt confident about our case. But confidence wasn't certainty, and I had been disappointed by the legal system too many times during this divorce to fully trust that justice would prevail over Dexter's money and connections and willingness to lie. The ruling arrived on a Friday afternoon via email, and I sat in my empty house staring at the notification on my phone for a full 5 minutes before I could force myself to open the attachment and read what the judge had decided. The legal language was dense and formal, full of citations and precedents and careful analysis of property statutes. But the conclusion was clear and unambiguous, and more than I had dared to hope for in my most optimistic moments. The judge ruled that the house was my separate property, that Dexter had no legal claim to any portion of its value or equity, that the previous asset division order would be modified to reflect this clarification, and that Dexter had 30 days to remove any personal property he claimed from the premises, if he had not already done so. Furthermore, the judge noted that any attempt by Dexter to claim an ownership interest in the property or to interfere with my quiet enjoyment of it could result in contempt charges and additional penalties, essentially warning him not to try any further legal maneuvers to contest this ruling. I read the ruling 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly, then called Patricia, who confirmed that this was a complete victory, that Dexter had lost entirely and had no grounds for appeal. On this specific issue, the house was mine free and clear, all $500,000 of value and $300,000 of equity, representing financial security and independence that would allow me to rebuild my life on solid ground, instead of the shifting sand I had been standing on. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my living room, feeling emotions wash over me in waves that were too complex and powerful to name or separate. Relief and vindication and triumph mixed with sadness and anger and a strange kind of grief for the marriage that had ended so badly and the man who had become someone I no longer recognized. Dexter's response to the ruling came not through legal channels but through a series of increasingly angry text messages that started arriving that same evening. He accused me of stealing from him, of manipulating the legal system, of being a vindictive witch who cared more about hurting him than about doing what was right. He claimed that I had always been selfish and greedy, that this was proof of my true character, that everyone would see me for what I really was now that I had shown my willingness to destroy him financially. The messages kept coming for hours, each one more unhinged and desperate than the last, until finally Patricia advised me to block his number and forward all the texts to her in case we needed them as evidence of harassment. I blocked him with a sense of finality that felt both frightening and liberating, cutting off the last direct line of communication between us, and accepting that the man I had loved was truly gone forever. The next few weeks were a blur of practical details and emotional processing as I began to truly claim the house and my life as entirely my own. I hired a locksmith to change all the locks on every door, standing beside him as he removed the old hardware that Dexter had keys for and installed new deadbolts that only I could open. That simple act felt deeply symbolic, a physical representation of taking control and securing my space and making it clear that Dexter was no longer welcome in this home that had never legally been his. I went through every room removing items that belonged to him or reminded me too strongly of our life together, boxing them up and leaving them on the front porch for him to collect during a scheduled time when I made sure to be away from the house because I couldn't bear to see him face. After everything that had happened, I threw myself into home improvement projects with an energy and enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years, reclaiming each space and making it reflect my taste and preferences rather than the compromises that marriage had required. The living room walls that Dexter had insisted be painted a dark charcoal gray because he thought it looked sophisticated, were repainted a warm cream that made the space feel bright and welcoming. The heavy leather furniture that he had chosen because it looked expensive was donated to charity and replaced with comfortable pieces in soft fabrics and cheerful patterns. I hung art on the walls that I had always loved but that he had vetoed as too colorful or too whimsical, filling the house with images and objects that made me smile instead of just serving as neutral background. Every change was an act of reclamation, a way of erasing his presence and asserting my own identity in a space that was finally and completely mine. My friends and family began visiting again, filling the house with laughter and conversation, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from people who genuinely care about each other. My sister Corinne flew in from Seattle for a long weekend and told me repeatedly how different I looked, how the cloud that had been hanging over me seemed to have lifted, how I was more like my old self than I had been in years. We stayed up late drinking wine and talking about everything, and she told me that she had always known Dexter wasn't good enough for me, but hadn't felt like she could say anything during the marriage without risking our relationship. I felt a mixture of gratitude for her support now, and sadness that she had felt unable to speak up earlier, wondering if things might have been different if someone had challenged me to see what was really happening in my marriage, before it was too late. I started taking care of myself in ways I had neglected during the darkest months of the divorce. Going back to the gym and cooking healthy meals and even booking appointments with a therapist who helped me process the trauma and betrayal and complicated emotions that came with ending a 15-year marriage. The therapist helped me understand that I had been in an emotionally abusive relationship longer than I had realized, that Dexter's constant criticism and undermining of my confidence had been deliberate tactics to maintain control, rather than honest expressions of disappointment. She helped me see patterns I had missed or excused, moments when he had gaslit me or manipulated me or made me question my own perception of reality. The sessions were painful but necessary, helping me rebuild my sense of self-worth and teaching me to recognize red flags I should watch for in future relationships. I reconnected with old friends that Dexter had slowly edged out of my life over the years through subtle disapproval and scheduling conflicts that never seemed to work out. He had never liked Marlo because she was too opinionated, or Kendrick because he was too liberal, or Sutton because she was too successful and made him feel competitive and threatened. I had let those friendships fade, rather than dealing with Dexter's discomfort, choosing peace in my marriage over loyalty to people who had been there for me long before he entered my life. Now, I reached out to apologize for my absence, and to ask if they might be willing to give me another chance. And to my surprise and relief, they welcomed me back without judgment or resentment, just genuine happiness that I was free from a relationship that they had all recognized as unhealthy, even when I couldn't see it myself. I started painting again, something I had loved passionately in college but had abandoned when Dexter made it clear that he considered it a waste of time that could be better spent on more practical pursuits. I set up an easel in the spare bedroom that had been his office, turning that space into a studio filled with canvases and paints and the creative chaos that comes with artistic work. I painted for hours at a time, losing myself in color and form and the meditative process of transferring images from my mind onto canvas. Most of what I created wasn't very good, at least not by any objective standard, but that wasn't the point. The point was reclaiming a part of myself that I had buried to make room for Dexter's needs and preferences. Remembering that I was a person with interests and passions beyond being someone's wife. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I started hearing rumors through mutual acquaintances that Dexter and Liana's relationship was falling apart in spectacular fashion. Apparently the excitement and passion that had justified blowing up a 15-year marriage wasn't enough to sustain them once they were actually trying to build a life together in the real world, with all its mundane challenges and responsibilities. Liana had apparently expected that Dexter would maintain the same lifestyle and financial status he had during our marriage, not understanding or caring that divorce had significantly impacted his resources and prospects. When she realized that he was now living in a modest apartment and driving a used car and couldn't afford the expensive restaurants and weekend getaways that had characterized their affair, her interest in the relationship cooled considerably, and obviously. I heard that they fought constantly about money and priorities, that Liana resented having to split bills and cook at home instead of being wined and dined the way Dexter had courted her while he was still married to me and spending our joint funds. I heard that she had started seeing someone else, a partner at a law firm who could provide the lifestyle she felt entitled to, and that Dexter had found out in a way that mirrored exactly how I had discovered his affair with her. The poetic justice of the situation wasn't lost on me, but I found that I felt less satisfaction in his suffering than I had expected. Mostly I just felt sad that so much pain and destruction had been caused for a relationship that was always going to fail because it was built on lies and fantasy, rather than genuine connection and shared values. Dexter called me one night, about a year after our divorce was finalized, and I almost didn't answer because I had blocked his number and didn't recognize the one that showed up on my caller ID. But something made me pick up. Some instinct or curiosity, or maybe just a need to face whatever he had to say, rather than wondering about it forever. He was drunk, that much was immediately obvious from his slurred words and emotional tone. And he launched into a rambling apology that covered everything from the affair to the divorce proceedings to specific cruel things he had said and done during our marriage. He told me that leaving me was the biggest mistake of his life, that Liana had been exactly what he deserved for betraying someone who had truly loved him, that he understood now what he had lost and would give anything to go back and make different choices. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately, to refuse to give him the absolution he was so desperately seeking, to let him sit with his regrets and bad decisions the way I had been forced to sit with the consequences of his choices. But another part of me, the part that had loved him once and remembered the good years before everything went wrong, couldn't quite muster the cruelty that rejecting him entirely would require. I let him talk until he ran out of words, and then I told him quietly but firmly that I forgave him, but that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation or forgetting what had happened. I told him that I hoped he would learn from this experience and treat his next partner better than he had treated me. I told him that I was building a good life for myself and that I needed him to respect that by not contacting me again, except through lawyers if some legal necessity arose. And then I hung up before he could respond, before I could second-guess my words or be pulled back into the emotional whirlpool that had characterized the end of our marriage. That phone call was the last direct contact I had with Dexter, and in many ways it provided closure that the legal proceedings never could. I realized that I truly had moved on, that I was no longer angry or hurt in the acute way I had been during the worst of our divorce, that I could wish him well without wanting him back in my life in any capacity. The house that had been the source of so much conflict and legal maneuvering had become a symbol of my independence and resilience, a physical space where I was rebuilding myself and creating a life that belonged entirely to me. I thought about keeping it forever, about growing old in these rooms that had witnessed both my greatest heartbreak and my most empowering victory, about filling it with new memories that would eventually outnumber and overshadow the painful ones from my marriage. But after living there alone for 2 years, I came to realize that I would never be able to fully separate the house from the history it contained, that every corner would always whisper reminders of what I had lost and what I had survived. I decided to sell it and start completely fresh in a space that had no connection to Dexter or our failed marriage, a place where every memory would be new and mine alone from the very beginning. The real estate market was strong, and the house had continued to appreciate, meaning that I sold it for nearly $600,000 and walked away with close to $400,000 in equity after paying off the remaining mortgage. That money represented freedom and security, and the ability to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. A luxury I had never experienced in my entire adult life until that moment. I found a charming bungalow on the other side of town, smaller than the house I was leaving, but full of character and light, and the kind of quirky architectural details that mass-produced modern homes lack entirely. It had hardwood floors that creaked in a friendly way when you walked across them, built-in bookshelves that lined an entire wall of the living room, a kitchen with vintage tile and original cabinets that just needed some love and refinishing to be beautiful again. The backyard was small but private, surrounded by mature trees that provided shade and a sense of seclusion from the neighbors. I put down a substantial down payment using the proceeds from selling my previous house, and my mortgage on the new place was less than half what I had been paying before, giving me financial breathing room that felt almost decadent after years of living paycheck to paycheck despite Dexter's supposedly impressive income. I decorated the bungalow exactly how I wanted without compromise or negotiation, filling it with colors and textures and objects that spoke to my aesthetic and brought me joy. I adopted a dog from the local shelter, a medium-sized mutt named Jespo with floppy ears and soulful eyes who followed me from room to room and slept curled up at the foot of my bed every night. Having Jasper changed my life in ways I hadn't anticipated, giving me companionship and purpose and a reason to get up and go for walks every morning even when I didn't particularly feel like leaving the house. He loved me unconditionally in a way that was healing after years of feeling like I had to earn affection. Through perfect behavior and constant accommodation of someone else's needs and preferences. I started dating again about 6 months after moving into the bungalow. Tentatively at first because I was terrified of making another mistake and ending up with someone like Dexter, who would gradually erode my sense of self until I didn't recognize the person I had become. I went on a series of awkward first dates that went nowhere. Coffee meets and lunch dates with men who were perfectly nice but with whom I felt no real connection or chemistry. I was starting to think that maybe I was just meant to be alone, that my capacity for romantic love had been damaged beyond repair by everything I had been through. When I met Callahan Monroe at a bookstore on a rainy Saturday afternoon in March, he was browsing the mystery section at the same time I was, and we both reached for the same book simultaneously. Our hands colliding in a moment so cliché that we both laughed at the absurdity of it. We started talking about books we loved and authors we had discovered recently, and the conversation flowed so naturally and easily that when he suggested we continue it over coffee, I agreed. Without the usual anxiety and hesitation that had characterized my return to dating. Callahan was different from Dexter in almost every way that mattered. Though on paper they had some surface similarities that might have made an outside observer think they were the same type of man. They were both professionally successful in corporate careers, both tall and reasonably attractive, both intelligent and well-educated. But where Dexter had been controlling and critical and emotionally manipulative, Callahan was supportive and encouraging and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings and goals. Where Dexter had gradually isolated me from friends and interests that didn't serve his preferences, Callahan actively encouraged me to maintain my friendships and pursue my hobbies and spend time on things that mattered to me even when he wasn't involved. Where Dexter had made me feel like I was never quite good enough and needed to constantly improve to deserve his love, Callahan made me feel accepted and valued exactly as I was, while also supporting my growth and evolution as a person. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed, and that time was a revelation in what a healthy relationship could look like when both people were emotionally mature and genuinely committed to each other's well-being. We had disagreements and occasional arguments like any couple, but we learned to fight fair and communicate clearly and apologize sincerely when we were wrong. Callahan never used my vulnerabilities against me, or threw past mistakes in my face, or made me feel stupid for having emotions. When I was having a bad day struggling with the lingering effects of my divorce trauma, he held me and listened and validated my feelings without trying to fix me or rush me through my healing process. When I accomplished something I was proud of, whether it was finishing a painting or getting a promotion at work or just making it through a hard week, without falling apart, he celebrated with me genuinely and enthusiastically, without any undertone of competition or resentment. His proposal happened on a hike we took together in the mountains outside the city, at a lookout point with a view that stretched for miles in every direction under a brilliantly blue sky. He told me that he loved me completely and wanted to spend his life with me, that he saw my strength and resilience and kindness and was constantly amazed by who I was as a person. He said that he wanted to be my partner in every sense of the word, building a life together as equals where both our voices mattered and both our needs were important. The ring he offered was simple and beautiful. A sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that he had chosen because he knew I had always preferred colored stones to traditional diamonds. I said yes without hesitation or doubt, knowing deep in my bones that this was right in a way my first marriage had never truly felt, even in the best of times. We planned a small, intimate wedding with close friends and family only, deliberately choosing to keep it simple and focused on what mattered rather than turning it into a big production for the benefit of people we barely knew. The ceremony was in a garden at a boutique hotel, and I wore a dress I actually loved rather than something chosen to please other people or meet traditional expectations. Corinne was my maid of honor and gave a speech that made everyone laugh and cry. talking about how she had watched me survive and grow and become more fully myself than I had been in all the years she had known me. Callahan's vows were thoughtful and specific, and everything I had ever wanted to hear from someone who claimed to love me. Promises about partnership and respect and growing together, rather than generic platitudes about love and cherishing that sound romantic, but don't mean much. In practical application, when we bought our first house together about 6 months after the wedding, we sat down with the real estate agent and the lawyer and made absolutely certain that both our names were on every document, that ownership was clearly established as joint and equal, that there would never be any question about who had rights to the property we were building our life in together. We joked about my past experience and my hard-learned lesson about the importance of titles and deeds, but underneath the humor was a serious commitment to transparency and fairness that I knew would protect us both if anything ever went wrong. Not that I believed it would, not that I spent time worrying about Callahan turning into another Dexter, but I had learned that hope wasn't the same as foolishness, and that protecting yourself legally didn't mean you didn't trust your partner. Emotionally, we've been married for 3 years now, and I can honestly say, without reservation, that I'm happier than I've ever been in my entire adult life. Not because everything is perfect or easy or without challenges, but because I know who I am now in a way I never did during my first marriage. I know my worth and my boundaries and what I will and won't accept from people who claim to love me. I know that I survived something that could have broken me permanently, that I found strength I didn't know I possessed, that I rebuilt my life from scratch when it would have been so much easier to give up and stay stuck in bitterness and victimhood. I know that my name being on that deed wasn't just a technicality or a lucky accident but a symbol of something deeper, a reminder that power and ownership and control can exist in places we forget to look until desperation forces us to. Search every closet and open every forgotten box. I think about Dexter sometimes, usually when something triggers a memory or when I pass a place that we used to go together back when we were happy or thought we were happy. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he remarried someone he met through an online dating service, someone who apparently has children from a previous marriage and comes with her own complicated history and financial obligations. I heard that they moved to a different state to start fresh, away from all the gossip and judgment that followed Dexter after the way our divorce played out in our small-town social circles. I genuinely hope that he's found peace and learned from the catastrophic mistakes he made with me, that he's treating his new wife better than he treated me, that he's becoming the kind of man who builds people up rather than tearing them down to make himself feel superior. But mostly I don't think about him at all anymore because he's simply not relevant to my life or my happiness or my future in any meaningful way. The house that saved me, the property that gave me the financial security and independence to rebuild my life exactly how I wanted it, is gone now. Sold to a young couple with stars in their eyes and dreams of the future they'll build together. I hope their story has a happier ending than mine did in that space. Hope that the walls I repainted and the garden I tended will witness love that lasts and grows deeper, rather than love that curdles into resentment and betrayal. But even if their story eventually takes a painful turn the way mine did, I hope they'll remember that surviving heartbreak is possible, that reclaiming power from people who try to take it is possible, that rebuilding a life worth living is always possible no matter how destroyed you feel in your darkest moments. The deed with my name on it taught me that the details matter, that the things we overlook or forget about or shove to the back of the closet can sometimes be exactly what saves us when everything falls apart. If you're listening to this story from somewhere in the world right now, if you've ever felt like someone took everything from you and left you with nothing but pain and regret and questions about how you'll ever recover, I want you to know something important with every fiber of my being. You are stronger than you think you are right now. The pieces of your broken life can be put back together into something even more beautiful than what you lost, something more authentically yours because you built it with wisdom earned through suffering. The power you think is gone forever might be hiding somewhere unexpected. waiting for you to notice it and claim it and use it to change your story from one of victimhood to one of survival and eventual triumph. Check your closets, both literal and metaphorical. Look at the documents and details and small things that seem insignificant. Remember that justice sometimes hides in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to search for it until they find what they need. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story and for allowing me to share the darkest and brightest chapters of my journey from devastating loss to hard-won victory. If this story resonated with you in any way, if it gave you hope or strength or just the comfort of knowing you're not alone in your struggles, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience and transformation and the incredible strength human beings find when they're pushed to their absolute limits. And please leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because I would genuinely love to know that my story reached you wherever you are, that my experience might help someone else who's going through their own nightmare and wondering if they'll ever feel whole again. Remember that you're never truly alone in your pain, that other people have walked through fire and come out the other side transformed, that your story isn't finished yet, and the best chapters might still be waiting to be written by the person you're becoming through this trial. Your name might already be on the deed to your own salvation, even if you haven't discovered it yet. Even if you've forgotten it exists in the back of your own metaphorical closet, waiting to change everything. The moment you remember to look for it and claim what has always belonged to you.